Silesia, the Beskydy legend. Tess, August 2000. The Pokorny family lived as high as the 6th floor, on the same side of the building as Tereska. The elevator went up without trouble almost all the way, but then got stuck between floors. When she opened the inner cabin doors, all she could see was a wall. A wave of claustrophobia seemed to squeeze her stomach. It felt as if she had stepped into one of her nightmares. For a moment she panicked and kept pressing the button for the 6th floor until she remembered something a neighbor from the top floor had once mentioned in passing. When the elevator got stuck, you had to press the ground floor button, ride down, and then try the higher floor again. She pressed the ground floor button and the elevator descended. Then she pressed 6 again. When she opened the inner doors at her destination, she saw that the elevator still hadn't reached the floor completely and had stopped several dozen centimeters lower. But it was possible to get out. She pushed against the outer doors, climbed over the protruding masonry, and was free. She knocked on the Pokorny's apartment door, and Yirka's dad opened it. He greeted her in his peculiar, non-standard accent, with endings like EG in Dobry or E in Hezke, so instead of Dobry den or even Dzień dobry, he said Dobre den, and instead of Thor, yeah Hezkai, Thor, yeah Hezgi. He invited her in. She slipped off her slip-on shoes and went straight to Yirka's room. When she entered, he was in the middle of playing a computer game. After he noticed her, he waved and smiled at her, then kept playing for a while longer before giving her his attention. She knew he would play until he reached a point where he could save the game so his progress wouldn't be lost. She sat down on his bed and waited. Gunfire and the groans of an animated character blared from the speakers next to the monitor. Meanwhile, Yirka's mum came into the room with open-faced sandwiches, a plate of sweet buns, and a bowl of fruit. Tereska stuffed herself while Yirka played, then later tried to clear the food remnants from the table and the pile of empty plastic bottles under the desk. When he finished, she told him about the strange image from another reality that had appeared in the road before her eyes that morning. He listened with raised eyebrows. "That's pretty weird, like, really weird," he said as he peeled a mandarin and left the peels lying on the table. Their scent filled the whole room. "I mean, it's weird that only you saw it and no one else, whatever it was." "Exactly. That it could only be seen from this building. That's technically impossible, isn't it?" Yirka wondered aloud. "I don't know. Is it?" she replied. "And not to mention that the other neighbors clearly aren't freaking out about it. They must have seen it too." "Maybe it was only there for a few seconds. I saw when it disappeared, but not when it appeared," she objected. "Even if it was just for a few seconds, someone else in the building would have had to notice it. It's Sunday, and lots of people are at home. My parents were home too, and they didn't see anything," Yirka said. "Maybe it could only be seen from a certain angle. Or you fell asleep, and it was just a dream. But I was standing by the window. You can have a micro-sleep even while standing. It's hot, you overheat, and your brain just shuts down." She sighed. She had to admit he might be right that even if the phenomenon had been very brief, at least one other neighbor, someone from the lower floors at least, should have noticed it. At the same time, she knew it definitely hadn't been a dream. She noticed the worried way Yirka was looking at her, probably concerned about her mental health. "So what are you doing tomorrow?" she asked, changing the subject. "I promised Mom I'd go with her to Poland to buy lamb's lettuce seedlings. Then I'll probably just keep grinding that game," he replied with a shrug. For the rest of her visit, they talked about what they might do during the last 2 weeks of summer vacation they had left. but they didn't come up with anything worthwhile. Tereska didn't have money for train trips or visits to cinemas, amusement parks, or swimming pools. It was already late evening when they said goodbye, and she went home. Her mum was still awake, sipping wine from a glass and watching television. Tereska brought her a mandarin and an apple and set them on the coffee table in the living room. "You're very sweet, Kitty." Her mum thanked her for the fruit, but didn't touch it. Then she asked whether Tereska had been at Yerka's. She said yes and sat down on the couch next to her. Some action movie with Bruce Willis was on. She decided not to bring up today's experience again in front of her mum. It was enough to remember the worried look on Yerka's face when she told him about it, like she'd snapped and he was watching her brain turn into jelly in real time. Soon a commercial came on. Mum muted the sound, but didn't take her eyes off the screen. "They called me from that bakery," she said. "How did it go?" "It didn't work out." "That's a shame," Tereska replied, trying not to sound too disappointed. Another commercial came on. Kids on TV were frolicking in front of an oven in which their mum was baking a bundt cake made with Hera margarine. Tereska's mum had made baked pasta in the oven once. "It sucks, but to tell the truth, maybe it's for the best. I probably wouldn't manage getting up at 3 every day and going to bed by 9 at the latest," her mum explained, more to herself than to her daughter. Tereska stayed silent, but her inner restlessness grew. She thought that it wouldn't be so hard for her mum to go to bed early and get up early if she didn't spend her evenings and nights with her greatest love, a bottle. But she couldn't imagine bluntly throwing in her mother's face what she thought about her behavior and her life. She wished her good night and went to her room. There she kept thinking over their situation again and again. The only place willing to give her mum a chance had been a small bakery in town. It had seemed like a done deal, the interview just a formality. And now her mum came back with the news that they hadn't taken her after all. It was infuriating. She had tried so hard to find her mum a job so they could finally have money and some order in their household. Even though she knew she would never have as cozy a home as Yerka's, she at least focused on beautifying the makeshift family life she and her mum were leading. But no matter how many job listings she wrote down, or how many bottles she cleared out of sight, of Grandma and the neighbors, it wasn't enough. For a moment, she wondered whether her mum had deliberately sabotaged the job, or whether she had truly tried to get it and failed. But then she realized it didn't actually matter. Whether her mum had given up on herself or not, Tereska couldn't give up on her for her own sake. She just needed to come up with a proper plan. Fefin, June 2001. Besides bullying, loneliness, and the feeling that he had disappointed his parents, Fefin was also tormented by unrequited love. He believed, however, that it could turn into a fulfilled one if only he managed to approach his chosen girl the right way. That was precisely why he sought advice in a men's magazine. There was no living person he could turn to for counsel. The only person in his surroundings and family who, in Fefin's eyes, had made it in the modern world and was sufficiently cool was his older brother. But his brother no longer lived in Veselin. He lived hundreds of kilometers away in Prague, where he studied during the school year and worked at an internship during the holidays. The question was whether the girl, Veronica, was even worth Fefin's interest. She attended a neighboring class and was around 12 years old, just like him. Yet she wore makeup, dressed, and spoke so maturely that she seemed much older to him. He admired her self-confidence and style. He didn't know that she was merely imitating what she had learned from older friends, and that inside she was just as insecure as everyone else in their grade. In addition to her performed confidence, Veronica's popularity at school was boosted by her natural beauty, slim figure, and expensive designer clothes. She had long chestnut hair that gently waved around a cute face without a single pimple. Despite a few straw-blonde streaks in her hair and her large blue eyes, she was tanned most of the time. Not like Fefin, who never really got a tan, and when he did, he usually just burned and peeled. For the entire 2 years they had passed each other in the school hallways, she had ignored him. Meanwhile, Fefin had had eyes only for her, almost from the very first day. He was far from the only one who liked her. Many others like him sent furtive glances in her direction in the corridors. But as far as Fefin could tell, he was the only one who so often took inconspicuous walks past Veronica's classroom in the hope of catching a glimpse of her. It was during one such patrol that he was lucky enough to run into her in the hallway while she was talking to their homeroom teacher. He sat down on a nearby bench, pretended to finish some homework, and pricked up his ears to catch as much of their conversation as possible. Veronica was discussing her planned absence from school. From fragments of the conversation, he understood that she would be flying to Greece with her parents and wouldn't return until July. That meant she wouldn't be coming back to school for the rest of the academic year, and Fefin wouldn't see her again until the beginning of the next one. It was terrible news. As soon as he got home, he began thinking about how to deal with the situation. There was little chance he would randomly run into Veronica somewhere in town over the summer, even if he tried to help fate along. She lived outside the city, in a business district surrounded by tall fences, which she probably left only in her parents' car when they took her to some upscale club, sport, or vacation. Fefin lived on the opposite edge of town, in a panel housing estate with a poor reputation. The only clubs or sports he could afford were those organized by his grammar school or the local youth center. If he wanted to see her in the summer, they would first have to become friends and exchange phone numbers or mailing addresses. Then they could arrange meetings by phone or letter. But the only instructions he had on how to approach a girl came from his brother's men's magazine. It wasn't a guide on how to become friends with a girl. It was about how to pick her up, and he had to work with what he had. On Monday morning, after practicing all weekend, he felt more or less ready to approach Veronica. It was her last day at school before her flight. He was extremely nervous, his stomach churning. His hands were sweaty, and he felt like he might throw up at any moment. Still, he summoned courage by writing down some key tips and lines which, according to Maxim Quo magazine, would guarantee to knock the woman of your dreams off her feet. On a small piece of cardboard. He didn't expect to read from it directly in front of Veronica, but he could refresh his memory from the cheat sheet just beforehand. When he arrived at school, he was struck by the gossip that had spread among the students that day and eventually reached him. People were saying that some pervert was going around all the high schools and grammar schools in town, smearing his feces on the walls and floors of the toilets. It seemed disgusting and insane to Fefin and everyone else. What annoyed him more, though, was that, of all days, this was the one when he needed to focus on something completely different. Fortunately, a morning math test helped push the repulsive image out of his head. He was fairly good at calculations and problem-solving, finished early, and by the end of the lesson was thinking only about how to get closer to Veronica. As soon as the bell rang, he began walking past her classroom. He knew he would first have to separate her from her friends, but it soon became clear that this was almost impossible. During neither this nor any subsequent break, did he manage to catch Veronica alone. Whether she was standing in the hallway or heading to the restroom, she was always accompanied by her loyal companions. Frustrated, Fefin couldn't understand what was so important that they had to talk about it even in the toilets. During the lunch break, he skipped lunch and instead loitered by the school notice board on the first floor, repeatedly checking the timetable of Veronica's grade. He also made sure that there would be as few other people as possible on their shared floor after lunch. He wanted there to be no witnesses to their conversation. Veronica might feel vulnerable during his attempt at negging and think he was deliberately humiliating her in front of others. Besides, he hoped that if the whole thing somehow got out of hand, at least not many people would be present for his embarrassment. Every time his eyes scanned the class schedules on the notice board, they were magnetically drawn to a notice in the middle. It concerned the weirdo who had been dirtying toilets all over town. So that was where the rumor among the students had originated. The printed text was flanked by enormous red exclamation marks. Fefin didn't like having to think about that thing again, just when he had managed to get it out of his head earlier that morning. He also felt queasy standing so close to the paper, informing them about the situation. It was as if something from its content was clinging to him, as if the filth described there were transferring a bit of grime onto Fefin himself. Today of all days, he wanted to think about love, not shit. Dear students, in recent weeks, an unknown perpetrator has been engaging in despicable and perverse behavior at all schools in our city. He signs himself as the Lord of Shit and soils the men's toilets in a way that I cannot even describe to you. Unfortunately, he has not spared the toilets of our school either. I sincerely believe that this perpetrator is not a student of our school and that it is someone from outside. Therefore, I appeal to all students. If you notice any unfamiliar person moving around the school building or loitering on our premises, please report it immediately to a member of the teaching staff. Also report any suspicious behavior. If you notice a restroom locked for an unusually long time, or if you see someone lingering in dark or hidden corners of the school in the afternoon hours. Thank you all for your cooperation, and I hope that together we will soon put an end to the rampage of Lord S. On behalf of the teaching staff and school administration, Jitka Sabova, Deputy Headmistress. Fefin turned away from Ms. Sabova's notice one last time, disgusted. He returned to class shortly before the bell to eat the rest of his snack, since he had skipped lunch. On Mondays, Veronica's lunch break was at a different time than his, so he hadn't even expected to run into her then. He would have to rely on the last break before the final lesson of the day. When that bell rang, he was so nervous that his hands were shaking. He could no longer wait for Veronica to be alone. He would be glad if she even came out of the classroom at all. If that happened, he would have to separate her from her friends at all costs. That was why this time he didn't circle around her classroom door, but stationed himself near the girls' restrooms. He considered it the only place where they might still meet calmly for those few minutes before the bell rang for the final lesson. He kept crumpling his cheat sheet in his hand, the piece of cardboard covered with a list of lines. 1 minute passed. 2 minutes remained until the end of the break. Oh no, Veronica would fly to Greece, and he wouldn't see her again until the end of the summer. Then, as if she had heard the call of his aching heart, 1 minute before the bell, she stepped out of the classroom and headed for the girls' toilets. Unfortunately, her two stupid friends went with her. They were heading to the restroom together, laughing. Now or never. Tess, August 2000. On Monday morning, Tereska wanted to begin planning Mom's return to a normal life, as she had titled the page in her notebook. But even after some intense thinking, she couldn't come up with anything other than what she had been doing so far: shopping, cleaning up traces, and combing through classified ads. She set the notebook aside and headed to the grocery store for milk, ham, and fresh bread. She didn't forget to grab a copy of the classifieds from the rack. When she turned toward the apartment block, she slipped the bunch of keys from around her neck and searched among them for the entrance key. Suddenly, she heard a man shouting at her, "Terry," and she immediately turned around. The moment she did, her heart skipped a beat. In the roadway, she saw the very same sight as the day before. At the same time, she registered one neighbor calling out of a window, "What?" and another replying, "I said Tuesday, ooh Terry." Someone's dog was barking. She realized she had been mistaken, that Terry had in fact been Tuesday, ooh Terry. She stopped paying attention to the neighbor's conversation and their dog and simply stared, transfixed, at the incredible thing in the very heart of the housing estate. Now that she was closer, she understood it wasn't some kind of three-dimensional image, but rather enormous, airy doors. Their lower edge was level with the roadway, meaning she could easily step straight into them. Just like the day before, the site was about 2 meters wide and 8 meters tall. Inside that living picture, she could see nothing far or near but a grassy field. She was no longer surprised that pedestrians continued along the sidewalk without noticing anything, and that cars drove straight through the thing, as if it weren't there at all. Whatever it was, only she could see it. She tossed the plastic shopping bag into the grass and waited until the traffic in both directions stopped. Then she quickly crossed the road and went straight up to the airy doors. Before she could take a step across their threshold, one of the neighbors noticed her. "Hey you, get away from there before something runs you over," he shouted. Tereska looked at him and saw that he was walking a dog. She checked the windows and made sure the other neighbor had already disappeared. Meanwhile, the dog caught a scent in the grass and bolted after it. The man staggered as the leash jerked in his hand and then flew out of it. She seized the opportunity and quickly stepped into the mysterious doors. By the time the man managed to regain hold of the leash and look back at the place where Tereska had been standing, she had vanished without a trace. She took a few more steps forward and excitedly began exploring the new world she had entered. The field, of which she had previously seen only a slice, stretched far in all directions. It was muddy and wet. The air was cold and heavy with moisture, as if it had rained recently and was about to rain again. She was wearing only a thin t-shirt, shorts, and flip-flops, and she was shivering with cold. Still, she didn't want to go back, so she clenched her teeth and rubbed her chilled arms. Her flip-flops sank deeper and deeper into the swampy ground with its tall grass. She looked around and saw cattle grazing toward the east, with small figures standing among them. She took off her flip-flops, held them in her hand, and set off toward them. She soon realized they were children, standing among the cows with switches in their hands and talking about something. She reached them without them noticing her and listened to their conversation. Tatush said that once Uncle sells the farm, he will repay Dad, and then we'll buy our own cottage and we won't live on someone else's land anymore. Then Dad will go to work or to the mine. If he earns more, I won't have to be out here with the cows, but I'll be able to go to school too," said a boy whose patched trousers were tied with a piece of string. "To which school? Czech or Polish?" asked a girl in a simple linen dress and a smudged skirt. "He didn't tell me." Tereska stepped up to the children, who could have been at most 5 years younger than she was, and addressed them. She didn't know how to begin without sounding like a lunatic, but she realized she wouldn't be able to avoid that. She hoped the young herders wouldn't at least laugh at her. "Hi, this will probably sound strange, but where exactly are we? What kind of place is this?" she asked, blushing. The children didn't even lift their heads and acted as if she weren't there at all. "Hello," she raised her voice and waved her arms in front of their eyes. They continued to ignore her and carried on with their conversation unchanged. She thought they were terribly rude children. Their game of let's pretend we don't see or hear anyone else struck her as pretty pathetic. She gave up on them and set off across the field in search of someone sensible who might be willing to answer her questions. Where the field ended at the top of a rise, the land sloped down into what looked like a village. She could see a church tower and rooftops and headed in that direction. She went down the slope and saw an old-fashioned woman in a headscarf and skirt, standing in what looked like a village green. She greeted her politely. The woman replied, "Dzień dobry," but looked straight through the girl as if she couldn't see her. Tereska glanced behind herself and saw another old woman, dressed just as old-fashionedly as the first. The second woman walked toward Tereska, but as if she didn't mind bumping into her, she kept going, forcing the girl to start backing away. Tereska thought the woman would notice, but she went on as if senseless. She was already so close that they were bound to collide. There was nowhere to dodge because any further retreat would make her bump into the first old woman. When the old woman was almost inside her, she closed her eyes, bracing for the impact. When she opened them, she just managed to notice the old woman's body passing straight through her. She gasped. It took her a second or two to grasp what had actually happened. While her pounding heart tried to leap out of her chest, she frantically thought about where she was and what kind of situation she had found herself in. That old woman had to be a ghost. No, wait. Tereska had died, and she was the ghost. She looked at her legs and hands. They looked full of life, but the two old women beside her also seemed full of life. She had to rule out the possibility that this was just some strange hallucination. She needed to see her hand pass through the old woman's body to be sure that it had really happened. To confirm the phenomenon, her hand would have to pass through the woman's head. Her fingers should slide like a knife through the old woman's scarf, hair, and skull, and in the end, Tereska's fingers should be sticking out of the wrinkled face. She stepped up to the woman and, holding her breath, stretched out her arm. To give herself courage, she closed her eyes and blindly thrust her arm forward, as if she were about to give a Nazi salute. Her hand immediately hit something hard. She cried out in pain. She opened her eyes and rubbed her aching fingers, trying to understand what had happened. Her hand hadn't passed smoothly through the woman's head. It had slammed into it with full force. She began apologizing to the woman, mortified, and it took her a moment to realize that the old lady wasn't perceiving her at all. It was as if she not only hadn't noticed Tereska speaking to her, but hadn't even felt the blow to the back of her head. It struck Tereska as downright outrageous how calmly the old woman continued chatting with her acquaintance as if nothing had happened, while she herself tended to her injured fingers. She dimly registered that the women were talking about the weather, illnesses, neighbors, and the work waiting for them at home. But she was so lost in her thoughts that she couldn't have said whether their joints hurt, or something had settled in their lungs, or whether the neighbors' children had diphtheria or whooping cough. Their chatter flowed around her as she experienced the strangest sensation of her life and tried to come to terms with it. Fefin, June 2001. Fefin headed straight for the group of girls making their way to the restroom. They were about to pass him, so he hurriedly called out to Veronica, afraid she'd slip out of sight. "Hi," he said more sharply and loudly than he'd meant to. The girl hadn't expected such a sudden loud sound and startled, jumping back. Strands of her thick chestnut hair rippled as she did. Clearly she hadn't anticipated someone shouting at her from the side just as she was rushing to the toilet. She looked at him first in confusion, then with concern. Her friends stood behind her, like castle guards, wearing haughty expressions. All three of them seemed to be waiting to see what would come out of his mouth next. "Can we talk alone?" Fefin asked, as evenly as he could. It took superhuman effort. Veronica's closeness almost paralyzed him. The presence of her friends only deepened his anxiety. The girl glanced around, as if she didn't quite understand what he meant. She probably thought he was asking her to go somewhere private together. One of her friends made things easier, apparently the one who needed to pee the most. She had a sharp, pinched face and eyes narrowed into thin slits. "So, we'll go without you then," she said to Veronica, rolling those slit-like eyes. The other friend, with a face like a picture, but plastered with too thick a layer of acne cover, giggled and followed right after her. "The bell's about to ring," she added from the bathroom doorway, to emphasize how badly timed Fefin's attempt at conversation was. The boy silently agreed. Unfortunately, this was his last chance. You know, I wanted to tell you," he began uncertainly, even though he'd planned to be in control and sound confident. But when he saw the hostile way she was watching him, his confidence slowly drained away and his voice betrayed him. Instead of the manly baritone meant to charm her, a croak came out. "That you've got a pimple," he croaked, shooting out his hand with an extended finger toward her forehead. He was still holding his cardboard cue cards in that hand. "Ow!" the girl yelped, clutching her eye, the one he'd jabbed with the cardboard. Her left eye began to redden. "Oh my God, I'm sorry, I didn't mean to." A terrified Fefin froze mid-motion, with his hand half raised. He had no idea what to do. Veronica angrily yanked the cardboard from his hand and, with her uninjured eye, looked at what he'd poked her with. "Stand sideways to her, so she doesn't feel like hunted prey with no escape," she read aloud. "No, not that," he shouted and snatched his cheat sheet back. "What is this?" she asked, taking a defensive stance. "Oh, nothing. It's for a friend." "What were you saying about a pimple?" "Here, on your forehead," he rasped. Veronica frowned and felt around the supposed spot with her fingertips. "What is your problem?" she snapped at him when she confirmed by touch that there was nothing on her forehead. Her friends, who returned from the restroom moments later, confirmed it too. Both examined her forehead critically, looking puzzled. The bell rang, and Veronica headed back to class with her classmates without looking at him again. Fefin, standing rigidly frozen, heard her recount the incident as they walked away. "What a moron," he caught the sharp-faced one saying, before they all burst into raucous laughter. He stood there like a statue for a while longer, blood rushing to his cheeks, darkness swimming before his eyes. Had he really just humiliated himself in front of the girl he loved, and on top of that, accidentally hurt her? This had been their first conversation, and after this fiasco, probably their last. His heart shrank. He should go to his classroom, but he couldn't bring himself to move. His eyes began to burn with tears. No, not that. He needed at least a moment of privacy to calm down. He darted toward the men's restroom, past the urinals, and opened the door of the nearest stall. He hoped he could sit there for a while and pull himself together. But even through the oncoming tears, he immediately saw that something was wrong.